Okay.
At a very young age, I came to understand that my body, as a symbol moving through space and time, is interpreted by society in different kinds of ways. That as I am in motion, other bodies that do not look like mine attach meaning to my body and definition to my movement. This has caused me to reflect constantly on my situation and the situation of others who look like me. I critique my body and my movement and my language, attempting to combat the meanings and definitions other bodies dissimilar to mine have assigned to my person and to my people. It is as if I am swimming upstream, attempting to evade or outmaneuver powerful and violent currents of water that are shaping me and redirecting my path, despite my efforts to breathe calmly and proceed on my own terms. I remember that evening when I was approximately 8 years of age. I was sitting in their family room playing while our parents were enjoying a conversation after dinner when the little girl suddenly whispered to her parents, "Why is his skin that color?" I remember after a basketball game when I was in sixth grade, one of the players on the other team gave me a high five, thanking me or congratulating me, it seemed, exclaiming that I looked like Michael Jordan. I was the only person of color on that court. I remember recess in elementary school on the playground in Oregon. We were all standing near the tetherball poles, which were located next to several multicolored four-square concrete diagrams of the court drawn in the pavement. We were all standing there doing something, I don't remember what specifically, when one of my classmates called me a nigger. I don't remember why, and I think that's the wrong question to ask. I remember when Saab, one of my best friends, was driving and I was in the passenger seat. Saab's younger brother in the back seat with his friend seated next to him. I remember pulling up to Saab's house, to the driveway, all of us in that car. It was a beautiful Michigan summer afternoon, and a lawn service company, comprised of several African American men, were cutting their lawn and trimming their bushes. "Oh, there's the niggers," Saab's younger brother's friend commented. Routinely, it seemed. Everyone laughed uneasily and looked at me. I too laughed and looked at me. In high school, I played football and my brother played soccer. So we were often hanging out around the sports locker rooms, weight room, and basketball courts, which made up the athletic wing of the school. Near the entrance to that wing of the school, there was a black and silver bench, and I remember after practice I was sitting there with my brother and our two friends on that bench. Apparently, a student had some of their belongings stolen out of their locker earlier that day. And I remember as we were all sitting there together on that bench, the athletic director approached, and despite the fact that all four of us were seated there and all four of us had backpacks, only my backpack was searched. I was the only person of color there. When I was 17, I worked as a dishwasher for a prominent upscale banquet hall that hosted wedding receptions and large events. So often I got off work past midnight. I remember being pulled over by a police officer as I was driving home one of those late nights after work. I had committed no crime. I was respectful and careful in tone and inflection. I had my vehicle registration, my note of insurance, and school ID. However, I had misplaced my license earlier that day. I had explained that I had just gotten off of work and provided my employer's name and address. I pointed to the banquet hall that was directly across the street, and the owners were well known and active citizens in the town. The officer arrested me, cuffs tight on my wrists, roughly placed me in the back of his suburban SUV police cruiser, and with a remarkable grin and disdain in his voice, radioed to dispatch, "This one might try and run." I remember that I had never had the impulse to run, but rather feeling abducted. As the metal cuffs dug into my wrist and I was locked inside of a car, late at night, with no one around, by a towering white man whom I had never met, that I regarded as a stranger, violent, and who I perceived as a threat to my safety. I remember my senior year in high school when I enrolled in honors debate. The first day after class, after all of my peers had exited the classroom, my teacher pulled me aside and explained to me that poor behavior and tardiness would not be tolerated. But she was going to hold me to the same expectations and standards as all of the other students, and that if I wanted to withdraw from the class, I had to do so in the first week. I found this strange because I had done nothing to indicate that I was disruptive. I had not communicated that I expected to be held to different standards or expectations, and in fact, I was early to class that day. And while I could have chosen public speaking, I specifically chose honors debate so as to challenge to myself and prove I could compete with other TAG and AP students. It seemed as though this educator did not want to educate me, and I don't claim to know why. Indeed, I was an athlete, and that meant certain things in terms of treatment and favor over non-athletes. However, I'm also a person of color, and I know all too well that racism is and has been thriving, and that racial stereotypes exist and are believed to be accurate and generally true. So that simply being black means certain things to certain people. And it's the uncertainty of the intent of why she pulled me aside after class when all of the other students were gone, the exact motivation, that is what is most haunting. I remember when my oldest brother, Zach, and my sister-in-law, Tracy, gave our family the news that Tracy was pregnant. And as everyone celebrated and congratulated them, and as I tried convincingly, I'm sure, to sincerely do the same, I remember that immediately, upon being told of the news, an influx of emotions overcame me. I'm adopted, and my three brothers and my father are all white men. I was afraid that what is now my niece Emerson would not accept me in the same way that she might my other brothers. That she might think of me as fundamentally different and might not associate me as real family because of my skin color. I remember those feelings, feeling like I was a stranger, and I remember internalizing those feelings. All of these experiences really get at the whole idea of identity and how identity provides accessibility and shapes social and cultural norms. Because in reality, we all participate, our identities are fully immersed in a social system and culture that recognizes and assigns inherent value to a particular kind of people or a particular kind of person. For example, based on gender or race, a value determined by the established and identifiable majority. And white people, as a corporate entity or racial phenomena, have always been the established and identifiable majority. And when identity becomes racialized and central to society, whiteness becomes a commodity. An existential ideal, whiteness becomes the expression of beauty, the expression of power, wealth, and therefore supremacy. Whiteness effectively becomes a privilege. This means that in certain kinds of material and non-material ways, white people, as a result of their majority status, the influence substantiated by that majority status, and therefore because of their whiteness, have been beneficiaries of certain kinds of material and non-material privileges. This has allowed, generally speaking, white people to be entirely oblivious to the experience of black and brown people operating in a society defined by whiteness, and it has allowed them to take certain things for granted. And whether I'm aware of this and sensitive to this reality or not, my aesthetic and my presentation of my person grants me unmerited access to advantages and opportunities others do not enjoy. Certain features of my own particular identity allow me to receive unearned privileges that others do not. As cisgender, heterosexual, male, and Christian, I, whether passively or actively, am a recipient of, and therefore participate in, all kinds of systemic privilege. And the key term here is systemic. My privilege as cisgender, heterosexual, Christian, and male is a privilege because there exists a very real system that is dictated by a patriarchal and heteronormative value structure, and that has repeatedly throughout history and into the present proclaimed and equated Christianity with patriotism, I would argue with whiteness, and therefore as an essential and true American value. Being a heterosexual male is celebrated as inherently superior and regarded as normative in our culture and society. Being cisgender is celebrated as the ideal and regarded as normative in our society. However available and very real these privileges may be in terms of opportunity, accessibility, and life chances, and despite how these privileges allow me to operate with a certain measure of autonomy and indeed privilege in society, they are fundamentally unearned or unmerited and are granted to me for systemic reasons outside of my immediate control and independent of my character and intelligence. Now, for some, this way of thinking can be immensely disruptive, that it may feel like an assault on one's integrity or ethic. Fundamentally, the mere suggestion that you may have received unearned help, that the system may have accommodated you in certain ways, challenges the assumption that says, everything I've attained, my material achievements, professional accomplishments, and educational success were solely because of my intelligence and hard work. It also confronts deep-seated ideas about American exceptionalism and individualism. It really gets at and confronts the myth of the American dream, the self-made man. However, the lived experience and the larger historical narrative of Black and brown people does not allow us the naivety of entertaining myths of grandiose success being achieved through means of individual hard work or individual merit. This is because there are structural conditions that limit our mobility and decrease our life chances and opportunities. People of color are twice as likely to be employed than white people, even when they have the same educational experience majoring in the same fields of study. Only 12% of college students at the nation's most elite schools are Black and Latino combined. White students are more likely than any other group of students to be accepted into their first college pick. Black babies are nearly 2.5 times more likely than white babies to die before reaching their first birthday. The wealth of white households was 13 times the median wealth of Black households in 2013, compared with 8 times the wealth in 2010. Likewise, the wealth of white households is now more than 10 times the wealth of Hispanic households, compared with the 9 times wealth in 2010. Black and Latino populations have much higher rates of contact with the criminal justice system than whites. Black men have a 1 in 3 chance of being incarcerated at one point in their lives and receive sentences 20% longer than whites on average when they are. While people of color make up 30% of the United States population, they account for 60% of those imprisoned. 1 in every 15 African American men and 1 in every 36 Hispanic men are incarcerated, in comparison to 1 in every 106 white men. A report by the Department of Justice found that Blacks and Hispanics were approximately 3 times more likely to be searched during a traffic stop than white motorists. Though African American juvenile youth are about 16% of the youth population, 37% of their cases are moved to criminal court, and 58% of African American youth are sent to adult prisons. African American women are 3 times more likely than white women to be incarcerated, while Hispanic women are 69% more likely than white women to be incarcerated. Despite these unjust socioeconomic and political realities for people of color, there are important and critical ways for white people to be healthy allies and stand in solidarity with Black and brown people. First, becoming aware of your privilege can act as an empowering force that can encourage activism in racial equity and political and social justice issues. By becoming aware of your privilege, you can know how and when to redirect it and use it to bring attention to the oppression happening to brown and Black people daily. Because of your aesthetic, you can influence other white people in ways that are more difficult for people of color to do. And despite the criticism anti-racist activists who are white men and women have received from some members of the Black and brown community, it is my view that we need as many allies as possible, particularly white allies who can communicate to white audiences in ways that people of color cannot, or that may be more difficult to do. And truthfully, whiteness, white privilege, and white supremacy are issues only white people can truly liberate themselves from. It is not my responsibility, but yours, and you must, with honesty and on a deeply intimate and rigorous level, interrogate your whiteness and the implications of it. We must see ourselves in one another. Our fundamental likeness must become central. And it is my belief that together and in community, we can effectively challenge, confront, and correct the racial injustice and oppression that continues today. At this point, following the format of last week, I'd like to open up the floor for a conversation. Any questions about anything that I've said that may need clarification, or ideas and insight of your own?
First of all, I just want to affirm everything you said and just express that was wonderful.
Thank you, man.
And I'm very grateful for you having the courage to share that with us, and to hear your voice is tremendous, and we're very blessed to have you as a part of our community.
Thank you. So there are no questions that are off limit. I think this is a safe space. I know it's a sensitive topic, but I welcome and invite all questions, if there are any.
Were all those statistics for the U.S.
Yes.
as a whole? I'm curious if there's been any looking into more demographics, like inner city versus suburbs, or costs or anything, because I don't know anything about those, or most of the statistics you went through. I'm just not familiar with them, but I wonder how it differentiated between those.
That's a good question, and I don't have any numbers with me, but I'd love to look into that and see what's there.
I don't think the new Jim Crow even really breaks it up by like density of population.
No, I don't think so either. But that's a great resource, and I know we've talked about that book here. Again, it's The New Jim Crow by a woman named Michelle Alexander.
I think there's a book out there. Well, I think it's in this book. There is a book called How Ghettos Happen. And it was all about redlining and all of the sort of political policies in the 50s and 60s that basically like separated black and white neighborhoods essentially, and kind of just shoved more people of color into the city and more white people in the suburbs.
Yeah.
And I think they have some of those statistics in that book.
In The New Jim Crow?
No, in how ghettos happen.
Okay.
It might be somewhere.
Okay.
I don't remember the last name.
Yeah.
The new Jim Crow is available to anybody that wants a copy of it. I can get you an ebook, and I highly recommend it.
Yeah, so something Don brought to my attention that I thought was valuable. So when we have conversations about race and racism, there's a lot of terminology that's involved in that conversation, one of which, white supremacy. I've said that a few times today, and I often say that when I talk about this topic. And I think that term is largely misunderstood. I kind of want to ask or open up the floor and get a feel for what you guys think of when I say something like white supremacy.
I think it's the fact that what you're talking about, white privilege, the fact that systems are inherently biased towards white people.
Sure.
It's supremacy in that way.
Mhm.
You don't have to think about it.
Right.
Honestly, my knee-jerk reaction to think of it is how I expected you to say it, actually, how it came from Alabama. It's like Ku Klux Klan.
Sure. Well, yeah, so I mean, I think that it's
It's
the
fine.
traditional
Sure.
thing that you connected
Yeah.
with the,
Contextually, yeah, I do.
I think
Highway.
the more appropriate definition of it is kind of what I was describing. But yeah, that's definitely the thing that you first think of.
Yeah, we need you.
White supremacist groups.
Would you parse the terms white privilege and white supremacy?
Well, I think white privilege exists because of white supremacy.
Right, I
Um,
agree with that.
so I don't think I would.
Do you think though? I guess to me, one, like white supremacy seems more overt and nefarious, whereas
Mhm.
white privilege seems more of like a byproduct, maybe?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because when I say something like white supremacy, I don't necessarily mean individual acts that are clearly racist. When I say white supremacy, I'm talking more about kind of like an abstract concept. The idea of whiteness giving a privilege to an individual. So it's hard for me to dissect it and be like, well, this would be an act of white supremacy, and this would not. White supremacy only without white supremacy, I don't see white privilege existing.
Yeah, I would
That makes sense, yeah.
I would think that in terms of like white supremacy is the fact that whites have been the ones who've had power and
Right.
been in control of these things, and it's the reason for these systems, and because of that, we have white privilege.
Right.
So is white supremacy a descriptor or an attitude?
I would say it's an environment. I don't know if that's helpful.
I think where I might be getting caught up is you would actually say the first thing comes to mind, like the Ku Klux Klan.
Sure, yeah.
So when I hear white supremacy, that seems more like political attitude or an extremist attitude. Of
See,
like,
Yeah, so I would characterize white supremacy as the majority. So the majority has a disproportionate influence on all of its citizenry, which that reality in and of itself is white supremacy.
I would say that white supremacist groups, and the reason there's this conflation of ideas is that white supremacist groups are trying to advance and maintain white supremacy.
Right.
It's not
Right.
It's not an attitude so much as their attitude is to support white supremacy.
I wonder.
That's how I would.
I wonder if though, and maybe I'm alone in this, but I wonder if the phrase has taken on in culture like more of that extreme of like not just something that exists, but that's something that people are fighting for
Yeah.
actively.
So the thing is, though, I don't view white supremacy as something that you're trying to intentionally advance. I would just say white supremacy is indeed the reality.
You wouldn't
It
say
has
that
been.
a white supremacist group like the Ku Klux Klan is trying to advance white supremacy.
No, I would. No, I would
Okay.
say that.
Yeah.
But even if they're not, white supremacy still exists
Right.
structurally.
That's what I
Yeah,
was trying to-
systemically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's what I was
Okay.
saying. There is white supremacy.
Yeah,
white supremacists are trying to maintain.
But I would even say, though, that there are good anti-racist white people who participate and perpetuate white supremacy
Yeah.
by their language and action.
Right.
So, again, for me, it's the whole culture, it's the whole system that gives way to white privilege.
Do you make a distinction between white centrism and white supremacy? Like white centrism being counterpart of like androcentrism, which is the bias towards men, or heterocentrism or heteronormativity. You make like a distinction between white supremacy and white centrism, or are they kind of like
So,
same?
yeah, so this is the first time I'm being introduced to that kind of language, and my instinctual reaction, having formed an actual full argument, is to say, no, I would not.
You wouldn't make a distinction.
No.
Kind of would, because I would say that white supremacy is, as you're saying, kind of the culture over it's like this abstract culture environment, or white centrism is more of kind of a paradigm, like a worldview.
See, but I would argue that white supremacy is a paradigm. It's just the normative paradigm.
Right. But I think it's broader than that. It's the whole system. It describes the entire environment in which we operate. Where a paradigm or a worldview is the way in which we view things.
Mm.
And so, I mean, there's obviously interrelations between the two, but and they inform each other.
What do you guys think? Would you draw distinctions between? Or what do you think?
Yeah, I would say like with white centrism, for example, I would expect the idea for like national holidays maybe to be born out of that. Like white holidays are, of course, we would celebrate them because they're they mate with our culture well. But white supremacy, I would say, would be more like or maybe that's backwards. I don't know.
Cool.
Is one focusing more on something because it's kind of easy and it's like your existence, so it's just kind of there, and the other one is more like, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. One is not purposefully exclusionary, the other one is, or is there any sort of spectrum of that, or?
I don't know. I'm not sure if there's a distinction.
My major, or my initial kind of thoughts on it, it's like the same.
I wonder if white centric would be like, so in a town like Blacksburg where it's, absurdly predominantly white, there tends to be some things, events and stuff that arise in that setting that reflect the whiteness of the town, as opposed to then that description of Blacksburg becoming prescribed on other things. And I feel like that's where kind of the supremacy part comes in. I'm also not familiar with thinking about white centrism, so I'm also just kind of grasping at straws here. But I feel like in some ways the white supremacy piece is because it's good to us here, and because there is white people in power or white cultures in power around us, therefore we apply it and it becomes something that's distributed. And it's that distribution part as opposed to just our current reality. So like if I had a whole bunch of people over to my house and every person was white, and the entertainment and the way we spent time together would be very white centric. But the moment that we make that the preference for things outside of that space and we apply it, instead of being descriptive of that, we make it prescriptive for culture around us, that's where white supremacy comes in, where it's given preferential treatment regardless of the demographic makeup. And I think that's the white supremacy is, in the way that I kind of process it, is that what is given preferential treatment. So whether it be Black scholars within theology, who it's a very small voice, well, probably just Black scholarship in general, not just even within theology, it's probably a relatively small voice, because of white supremacy is that we give preferential treatment to white voices, partially or primarily because they sound like us. And so it's popular to my ear, and so it feels whatever, and so we then elevate those voices, and then those voices, that becomes the systemic issue that exists. I don't know if that's accurate, because again, I would like to read something on white centrism, because I'm not really familiar with that term, but I think if I'm guessing right, I feel like that's kind of where it's at, is that the setting in the space, if it's white, it's going to be white centric in our expression. It becomes white supremacy when that then is preferential in other culture, or forced preference in more diverse settings.
So do you think that
I think that I could be completely wrong with what I just said.
like So when it's forced preference, you're saying that is white supremacy.
Yeah.
So when I think of white supremacy, I think it doesn't need to be forced, that it is indeed normative, that it just is.
Well, I would say I wouldn't disagree with
Yeah.
that. In fact, but I would just say that we may overlook that there is some forced preference in the sense that, for instance, if you go into a bookstore, you're going to find that the voices of the white community far outweigh the number of people of color. Whether you want to, not you personally, but whether we want to or not, recognize it, that's forced on us.
Right.
So that's a forced preference. So we all are handed only what has been promoted. So it's a forced preference on us. When we walk into a bookstore and we read the covers and we look at the authors that are there for us, that is forced upon us. And again, force doesn't necessarily have to imply
Malice.
malice.
Sure.
That's great. That was a great word, malice. Though I think often it is as well. But that's also, we don't question it because it is normative. And so we don't question, we just think, well, there's just not as many people of color that are doing scholarship or that are, studying in that field. And though sometimes that may be true, it might not be representative. And so because of it being normative, we've almost lost sight that it is forced on us. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes perfect sense.
I can come up with another example, I guess, that maybe expresses my thoughts on it a little more. You've heard of the school to prison pipeline? Basically the idea that children of color get punished more frequently and more severely than other children in school, and that leads to a pattern of behavior in society with the victims and the oppressors like kind of settling into their role that they're learning as children. And this is measurable, it's easily proven. Like, it's obvious that this is happening. There's actually data to prove it. So I would say that the internal bias towards Black children would be maybe an example of the white-centric sort of view.
So I would say, I mean, in your conceptualization of it there, then it's not really, it's kind of the same idea as white supremacy.
Yeah.
It seems the way you're talking about it, it seems like it's
Right.
the same idea.
So I think it's probably the same.
I mean, I think you could come up with alternate definitions. But
Sure.
could you talk a little bit about how you see white privilege playing into the church writ large?
Yeah. I think like the experience of being a person of color is very different than perhaps your experience. So growing up, I had mainly white men as mentors. They were helpful, very helpful, and I'm thankful for that help. However, as I became older and I was exposed to more of society on my own terms, independent of parents or teachers, I began to recognize that there are certain realities that are a part of my experience and unique to my experience because of the color of my skin that make it more difficult for someone who is not Black or brown to understand and relate to. Now that has huge implications because the advice I'm given spiritually, the ways in which I've been taught prior to my time in Blacksburg to interpret the text has been shaped by a majority white experience. So I think on the experience level there's difficulty, and it's not always there, it just depends on the person like most things, but just generally speaking that's been difficult and has kind of exposed the privilege of white in context. I think also just in scholarship. I mean, I recently posted on Facebook that I wasn't exposed to a black scholar that was not a theologian, that was not Dr. King until I was 20, 25. This was last year. That's a huge problem. I mean, that is a huge, huge problem because the sets of questions I have about God are directly related to my lived experience. And when I'm experiencing different kinds of racism, different kinds of racialized suspicion and microaggression, I then in turn approach the text differently. And I understand its language differently. So if I'm operating in a setting where that's not being acknowledged and that's not being elevated or recognized, there's an entire part of my identity that's being silenced, whether unintentionally or intentionally, it's being silenced.
Do you know anything about the differences theologically, maybe Dr. can speak to this as well, between dominantly African American churches and congregations and white, standard Southern Baptist or whatever?
Difference in theology?
Yeah. Is there a difference in the way things are approached
Yeah,
or
absolutely.
taught? I assume there is, but I don't really know it.
Yeah. Well, I've been brought up in a predominantly white church, and oftentimes, like the central theological questions and issues are around salvation, and that salvation is not here; it's elsewhere. So we're kind of grasping onto that promise of salvation in another world, whereas in the tradition of Black liberation theology, and not just Black liberation
I was
theology,
going to say, is that commonly is that a common paradigm in Black churches, or is that more of a there are scholars that think about Black liberation theology, or is that like if you go to an AME church, is Black liberation theology part of that?
part of what?
The way that Christianity is taught and thought about in Black churches more broadly than just like a theologian.
Oh yeah, I'm not sure if I understand your question, but let me respond
Okay.
and you can shape it. To begin with, I imagine that theology looks different for all kinds of people, regardless of race. So I think even within an African American tradition of Black liberation theology, you'll find a variety or a multiplicity of different ways of interpreting the text, expressing faith. Is that helpful at all?
Yeah. Well, so my question really was, we've talked about Black liberation theology,
Yeah.
but my question is that the theology that is commonly taught in AME churches or other African American congregations, or is it just a school of thought in theological circles?
Well, I don't know. I've never been to an AME church.
Sure.
I've
Well,
been
yeah,
to
AME
the
is
GCC. Yeah, but like the architect of Black liberation theology, James Cone, has kind of conceived within the framework of the AME tradition.
Okay.
I don't know if it's taught like as not protocol, but it's kind of standard in most African American churches. I'm not sure, but I do know the emphasis on a present state of liberation is super important. Whereas in contrast with my experience in a white church, salvation was elsewhere. It was later. Whereas now, liberation theology really highlights the importance of the immediate moment. And it's not just liberation theology. I mean, you spend any time with Don or Dust, which we are together, of course, here. This is like the Jewishness of the gospel message in the entirety of the text. The Exodus narrative was very tangible, it was very physical, it was very present. So yeah, that's one of the main differences, I would say. So for me, that means all kinds of things, that gives me space to approach the text with present day, real concerns affecting people who look a lot like me.
I'd say it's primarily also why you see the health and wealth theology rise up more in faith communities that are predominantly people of color, because there is a sense of God's rescuing and the rescuing of faith is something that's very tangible today, and a promise of safety, a promise of security today. And I think we need to be careful when we can quickly pounce on folks who have fallen into this way of thinking about faith as in some way providing financial blessings, because for most of us within the white church historically, we have not had to worry as a community as much about the next meal or safety or security or any of that type of thing. Whereas I think within the African American church, there's way more immediate need and immediate restoration that is craved, and I think that that's probably what you would notice the most. And again, as Chris aptly pointed out, and he always needs to be reiterated over and over, there's always a spectrum of teaching. But we've talked about this here before. Jesus is speaking to an oppressed people who are suffering and are marginalized. And as white folks, when we read it, and we read as if it's a 1-to-1 ratio of Jesus speaking to us in our current situation, we manipulate that power and become what we are today in the eyes of the world as evangelicals. Whereas for a lot of the churches that are made up of ethnic minorities, I think they're able to hear the message of Jesus on a closer to 1-to-1 ratio than what we ever could. And so the response to it is very different. As Chris said, growing up in a predominantly white church that hasn't experienced all the I remembers of Chris's writing. All those I remembers have everything to do with the way that Chris is going to view God or Jesus, especially because growing up in the white church, Chris was probably taught a white Jesus. And how that then gets processed and everything is drastically different than you and I would hear it. And we haven't historically been self-aware enough to give people space to hear the text through the lens of their unique body. So I feel like I got going and then lost where I was going. So that's
No, I mean, that's, yeah, so now I'm at a place where like the whole idea and indeed reality according to my faith of Messiah is directly related to the current oppression happening to Black and brown people. I can't see it. In contrast, it's directly related. So I mean, honestly, it's been a process emotionally and intellectually to, be open to different kinds of ways of understanding the gospel, because the gospel for myself and for other oppressed people is something so physical and so tangible. Anything that has to do with other world, salvation being in heaven and not on earth, and that's some other place. I have a hard time even being open and listening to that because I feel as though being brought up, I've been deprived of understanding that the gospel is indeed directly related to my immediate situation and condition. So I feel like I'm in this whole, it's empowering and liberating to be in this space, but it's also like, how do I take this, apply it, and then teach it? And I get disappointed too when I have other friends who are people of color who have grown up in the tradition I was brought up in and have no idea who James Cohen is, have no idea what Black liberation theology is. And for them, I see them, on Facebook or Twitter or in person, they're like, oh, I can't wait, and my salvation is secure, and all that stuff. And I'm like, dude, there's like this whole branch, like this whole school of thought that is all about your voice and all about your body, and you know nothing about it. And in saying that, I don't want to vilify that person or shame that person, but we've been taught to think certain things in certain ways. So I think an attempt to correct that and address that, this conversation in itself is awesome. Yeah.
I feel like I'm talking a lot, but I have another, I don't know if it's a question as much as a discussion point, but so kind of the concept that in some way, white culture is sort of historically foisted upon African Americans, including Christianity. And I think there's some people in the Black community that kind of rail against this, the fact that these cultural things have been foisted upon them, and Christianity is one of those things. I don't know what my question is, but just that. How do you feel about that idea? What is your take on the idea of Christianity as sort of this thing that's been as like a white cultural thing that's been kind of foisted upon African Americans? That Blacks have taken it up and they've made it their own. But
Sure. That's difficult because, my faith directly influences the way I think about that question. So, if Jesus is indeed, was indeed, is what we say, and the text is there, and God, and it's all, I have to imagine creatively that there's been a way for that to become owned and real, and tangible, independent of white influence and white coercion in that field of religion and indoctrination. That's a great question. I've never thought about that.
Yeah,
Christianity was a means of colonization of
Right.
indigenous people. So
Right.
yeah, that's
And,
interesting.
Maybe we believe in it, but at the same time, there's this historical context that's
Yeah.
pretty uncomfortable.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why I'm so surprised, and that's another reason why too I have like this internal aggression that I'm trying to confront, because like racism was super prominent and thrived in white churches. Racism and the idea of white supremacy was predicated upon the idea that God is like orchestrating this, that this is found in the text. We are indeed meant to be a superior people, so we must subordinate the minority, and that's God's will. We don't talk about that in church. And once that's talked about and we understand that and accept it, well, of course, theology looks different, and the questions we ask and the way we conceive of God and the Gospels and Jesus and the Old Testament and everything, we think about it differently.
Right.
Once we can accept that, wow, this was a tool, this was a weapon used to execute a lot of people. So yeah. We've got about 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Any last thoughts or questions? Mark, you got anything more?
I was just thinking that your story about the debate teacher.
Yeah.
One of the harder parts to hear in that story is the fact that I know if you had spoken up to the teacher, it would not have boded well for you.
Right.
Even though it should not have affected your grades would have been affected.
Mhm.
I think that's a difficult thing to maneuver.
Yeah, and we talked about that example prior, Don and I, and I had read what I was going to be talking about to my wife, and she was like, "Well, you kind of had a reputation. You kind of got into trouble, and your grades were kind of poor. Maybe that was why she did that." And I was immediately offended, but I couldn't put to language why. And help me out here, because you said some things, you talked about some things that were really helpful. Had I been white, I wouldn't have had to think that it was even based on race.
Right. You would have been
I would have
like,
just
oh,
been
this
like
is because my
face value.
reputation.
Right. But it's the suspicion, it's the unknown, it's the uncertainty that maybe this was because I'm biracial and brown. Maybe it was because of my race that she said these things. And that's what can be difficult. And even like we don't have Jim Crow South. We don't have black codes today. Racism is much more subtle in most instances. So to like say, oh my God, that was kind of racist, It's harder to just make that claim now.
Yeah.
Whereas I would argue in that situation, there was a lot of racially offensive and motivational things happening that would have been harder to identify.
And you were powerless to call it.
Right. Had I been like, this is you participating in racism, she would have been like, oh my God, no, I've said nothing. Like, I haven't called you this or that. I haven't said this or that. It's the undertones. It's the microaggression. It's the language, the coded language and suspicions that become more difficult to navigate.
It's much more insidious now. It's much harder to deal with.
Yeah.
Central code.
Yeah, that's another great book. Racist Without Racism. The Age of Colorblind Racism. It's a book I've used a lot. Right.
That's on the ebook list, isn't it?
Is it? Cool. Right.
Chris, can you speak to at all what our community, like this group here, how we can, one, be allies to you particularly because we have a deep relationship and love for you specifically. But also, what are things that you have noticed since you have been in Blacksburg that maybe our community could be a part of speaking into, against, whatever it might be? Like, how would Dust Covenant behave as a healthy ally, not just for you, though specifically for you, but also in our community?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I struggle with this daily because, like, my idea of activism is very much like we're in the streets protesting, thousands of us marching down Main Street. However,
So we're going to start with evangelism first to grow our church.
Educational awareness, though, is super important as a part of being an activist. So I think educating yourselves, if you haven't already, I know a lot of you have, but continuing to, and even just check your own language and check your own intent and motivation when you ask questions, when you say certain things, the language you use to talk about race. And honestly, a good practice I'm trying to do. So being a male, I'm trying to be more aware of how I talk about women and how I talk about, my role in sexism. And it happens a lot where I work. And I'm like, man, if that was equated to racism, how could this person then have responded? And how am I responding now to the situation with sexism? So I think, educational awareness is important. I would encourage, bringing diversity to whatever you're reading in your area of study. Try and, be more in tune with and give more of a listening ear to minority voices in scholarship. And this is the most difficult one because it requires certain things and it can have consequences that might be uncomfortable. But I mean, and I'll let you guys decide, when you need to do this and maybe when you need to not. But so, being a person of color, if I'm talking with all white people and someone says something super racist, I feel much less comfortable addressing that because I'm surrounded by people who might agree or might be uncomfortable with me addressing it. So in that moment, I think it's appropriate to insert yourself, and then you become that voice, and you kind of correct that person. And what that correction looks like, I don't know. That's a heightened level of discernment, I think skill even too. So yeah, I think in the opposite of that, if you're in the room and there's a black or brown person speaking, you need to give that person that space in that room to be speaking. So it's kind of like the reverse of the two. And I think, this is great. Even this in and of itself is great. Those of us who went to Tim Wise, that was great. And how that influences the way we interact at our place of employment or in the classroom. Continuing to just put yourself in spaces where you're exposed to minority voices and you're exposed to the experiences of minority people is huge. It's huge. And the thing is, it's a process. It's not going to be, oh my God, I get it now. I'm still learning things about race and racism that I have never even considered prior. So we have to understand that this is long term. Those of us who were there with Tim Wise, he had said those who were committed to any kind of racial justice work understand or need to understand that we will likely not see the fruits of activism. It will probably be much, much later. This has been an ongoing struggle, and we are today. So I would just, advise patience. And I like the language of interrogating whiteness. That's cool. And it allows for questions. And that can be a great way to learn. Yeah. Cool. Thanks, guys. I suppose before we wrap up, I need prayer with us.